Welcome to Monday Night Meetup. I'm your host, Commonwealth Victim Advocate, Suzanne Estrella. You've entered a safe space for thoughtful reflection and honest conversation. I need to let you know that there's no expectation of privacy. We are recording this. It will be uploaded at a later date to our YouTube channel, and we're streaming live on Facebook. Before we get started, I want to let you know about some programs that we have coming up soon. I can't believe it's already March. And soon it will be April. And April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. It's the month that we celebrate crime victims' rights. So there's a lot happening. But in April, we are going to be starting our first Survivor Lunch and Learn series. It starts on April 19th. Some information about that is going to come up in the chat box for registration. So it is for sexual assault survivors. It's going to be a 1-hour lunch and learn, and that one in April is going to be about the sexual assault trial. So if you'd like to learn some more information about that, please make sure that you register. We're asking participants to register early because we're actually going to send out some information in advance so that we can mail that to you before the lunch and learn on April 19th. Then on May 11th, our second series in that Survivor Lunch and Learn will happen same time from 12 to noon. And that one's going to be about empowerment, a pathway to healing. So you can register for both. You can register for one or not the other, whatever works best for you. But we're hoping that you'll avail yourself to those, take the opportunity, and that those trainings will be impactful for survivors. We also want you to be on the lookout for information about the celebration of Crime Victims' Rights Week on April 24th. We will be having the Crime Victims Rally and the Crime Victims Rally Summit at the Capitol. It's live. It runs from about 11 to 2. We hope that you can join us and be a part of that. We'll be elevating the voices of survivors during the summit. It's going to be a really great program. So I'm hoping that if there's any way you can get up to the Capitol on the 24th, that you will come and join us. There will be a light lunch provided. And tonight, actually, one of our sponsors for that program is the Pennsylvania Parole Board, and they are joining us tonight as we talk about crime victims' comment before the parole board. It's kind of a continuation of where we were last month. Last month, we talked about victim rights, and tonight we're talking about one particular right, and that is the right that survivors have to make comment before the Pennsylvania Parole Board. So I want to just give a general welcome to all of our guests tonight. And then as we kind of dig in a little bit deeper, they'll be able to introduce themselves and we'll move on from there. But I do want to provide some more background information just to paint a picture of what that's like. Sometimes I think that people don't realize that we have such a strong, the Office of Victim Advocate has such a strong working relationship with the Pennsylvania Parole Board, as well as the Department of Corrections. So I wanted to kind of highlight that tonight and to let people know that we both kind of sit centered in that same goal of creating safer communities. And the parole process is actually part of that process. So we work together to try to make sure that happens. Now, of course, we understand that many survivors are not in favor of parole, but there's never the intention that parole is granted to harm or to discredit victims or survivors in any way. The parole board has parameters on which they operate, and we'll be able to hear a little bit more about that tonight. But there's lots that go into that decision making, and the victim comment is an important part of that decision making process. So tonight, again, we have joining us Board Member Fox, Heather Julius from the Office of Victim Advocate, and then 2 survivors will also be here sharing about their experiences because they've actually participated in that process. So I'm gonna just start off with, and then I'll let Board Member Fox tell me if I describe this correctly or not. But when we talk about parole, what we actually mean. Parole is when an individual who is incarcerated in a state institution is released prior to their maximum sentence, but after their minimum sentence. There is no legal right that they must receive parole, but the board members take into consideration, they review cases, they think about safety concerns and they hear comments from victims prior to making that decision. But that early release means that the offender is released and serves the rest of their sentence outside of the institution while still receiving some form of supervision. And that's kind of where that whole safety piece comes into play. So Board Member Fox, did I describe that accurately?
I think you did that beautifully, yes.
Okay, all right, great. So tell us, what type of information does the statute allow you to look at when you're determining that decision-making process?
There is really a wealth of information that's required under the statute and that is provided to the board. So when we make these decisions, they are pretty informed. I just had to pull the statute up. It's in Title 61, and it talks about the nature and circumstance of the offense, the character and background of the inmate, the history of family violence, and their complete criminal record. And all these are assimilated into reports. So before we make any interview or parole decision, all those things are assimilated into one report. And then we also reach out to outside agencies such as the Department of Corrections. We're also required to consider their conduct while they're in prison, what their physical and mental health is. So we have psychological reports. If they've been sentenced, the notes from the sentencing hearing and the actual sentence that was imposed. Now, we don't always get those 100%. Because sometimes those transcripts are never transcribed and they're not sent to the board. But when they are transcribed, they're generally sent to the board. We ask the judge, the district attorney, if they have an opinion, and that's required under the law. And we're also required to use what we call evidence-based practices. So for us, that really is a structured decision-making, meaning we use a guideline that determines whether or not someone is likely to be paroled or not likely to be paroled. And it kind of assimilates different types of criminal behavior so that there's kind of one common guideline that we follow. But that's really based on actuarial risk assessments that we use to see what someone's actual risk of recidivism is, and also by professional judgment. The board does have minimum requirements, and most of them are exceeded. We have a number of lawyers and people that have been involved in prosecution, police officers, probation and parole, to put our experience together to make the release decision. But also, and probably most importantly, one of the things that at least I think is most importantly, is the victim information. So the victims have the chance to submit information to us in writing, and that's required under the law for us to consider, and also for in-person comment that they can give us. So all those things are wrapped into the parole decision, and they're all required under the law. And we do have all the information that we need. We really do have extensive information on the people that we review, so we can at least make an informed decision. But getting that victim information, we can often learn a lot of information that we wouldn't find in any file that we review. So that's where it's really, really helpful.
Wow, that's good to know. Let me ask you this on a more personal level. When you're hearing, because kind of we sit with a trauma and vicarious trauma, when you're listening to someone else's story, how do you process that? How do you work through that type of trauma?
That's a good question. And, there are days sometimes when I'm doing these victim days that, they're coming into the day and before the day that I feel almost like a victim somewhat, because you get a little bit of tense, a little bit kind of anxious about what you're going to hear, about how you're going to be. You want to obviously be empathetic to victims. You don't want to, make anyone more upset. We understand that this process can cause some trauma to them, so we want to be as empathetic as we can. But it also to understand secondhand trauma. And for me, it's always really important just to keep the perspective. No matter how difficult it is to kind of hear horror stories that you hear in criminal justice all the time, at least in our work, it's secondary, absolutely, and it pales in comparison to what these victims have gone through. I mean, when I was young in my late teens, I was robbed at gunpoint at a store I worked at. And, as hearing about that story is nothing like actually experiencing it. And so that it's easy for me to kind of keep that a little better in perspective. At least I try, but it still creates stress, and you have to recognize it. And for me, like exercising and making sure that I'm taking care of myself, being healthy in a lot of ways is also really important.
Great. Great. Thank you so much for that. Now, we also have two survivors joining us who have been a part of that process at one time. Karen and Beth, thank you so much for being on the program tonight, being willing to share your experiences. I know it's not always easy when you're asked to do that, but I really appreciate you. And we're hoping that other survivors will be able to kind of hear and get some understanding and make a decision about whether or not they want to be a part of the process or not. But I'll let you each take a turn answering, and we'll go ahead and start with Beth, just alphabetical order type thing, no other reason. But tell me, how did you prepare for the comment process?
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. So, I had always known that the day would come, but I always tried to focus on living my life and not, focusing on when he would be up for parole. My rapist had been sentenced to 30 to 70 years in prison, and he had been incarcerated for 28 years. And I had been involved with OVA and the Victim Input and Notification Program from the start, even though I don't think OVA officially was put together until years after the trial. But thankfully I did know because of that he would be in prison until at least 1 year before his minimum. And I had called in 2015 and did get confirmed that he would potentially be up for parole in 2016. And that if that were to happen, that the process would start with a letter that I would probably receive in December of the previous year. So even though I had tried to prepare myself for that, when that letter came from OVA in December of 2015, just like they said, my heart stopped. My PTSD was triggered. My husband and I, were overwhelmed with feeling and fear, and we weren't really sure what we were going to do. But I knew that I had this opportunity to share my input with the parole board. So the first thing I did was call OVA, even though the letter included a lot of information about what the process was, what I needed to do, what my options were. I still wanted to talk to someone, which I think is part of my process. And, just get all that information and also confirm confidentiality, because I had concerns about, who would see this, who would be in the room, how would they have access, where was it stored, whether it was a written comment or in person, and then who would be present in the room, when would I be, informed of the decision. I was trying to get as much information as possible, and I really appreciate OVA. Everybody was incredibly patient. Sometimes they answered my questions more than once, which I wouldn't have been able to do that without that support. And they also told me every time, not that I called every week, but that I could call as many times as I wanted, and I really appreciate that. And I also knew that what my rapist had done to me had affected so many aspects of my life. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, I had to do this. I wanted to tell them in person. I knew that it had to be in person. Even though I wanted it to kind of go away, I knew I had to make this decision. So, my first thought was, okay, what if he gets out and he finds out that I talked with the parole board? So again, I was worried about my safety, but I had to trust in the process. And I was told that it would be confidential. I had to believe that. My second thought was, how would I feel if he were released and I didn't provide some sort of comment? Would I regret that because I could have done something and hadn't? So I had to really consider these things, wondering if, would I feel safe if he were released? Would I have to move? All these things, trying to just collect information. I even wondered if maybe he had shown remorse in that 28 years. I didn't have the whole picture. I only had a little piece, and even though I knew the recidivism rate for pedophiles is high, I still had to trust in the parole board. But it was another consideration as I prepared for the process. And so as I went through, I I started reading and learning about everything I could about the process, like what the board would consider, who was on the board at the time, what the in-person process would look like, who would be notified, just all of everything I could find out. And then I sat down and I wrote about what my rapist had done to me, how it affected my life, my long-term health and well-being. I wrote about what the trial was like for me. I wrote about my PTSD, how my relationships were affected, how, the trust issues that I have, the effects on, my physical and emotional health and well-being, financial costs, spiritual costs, everything. And then I wrote about what I needed from the parole board, like if he were to get released. I had to think about, what restrictions I could request, like whether it was personal restrictions or like geographical restrictions. And, I had to keep trying to consider what would help me to feel safe if they made that decision to release him, and how could I keep my family protected. And I also thought about what I would need to do personally, which is also would be a financial cost, which would be like, then I need to start thinking about security systems in my house. How would I start to erase my online presence if he were to be, because that all takes time and effort. And maybe I would have to talk to some of the police or the neighbors in my neighborhood. But I know it's a lot, but these are just the ways that I process and the ways that I was trying to prepare for this. And ultimately, I will say, as difficult as it is, I understand that it is the parole board's job to decide. Like I said, I didn't have the whole picture, but I also know that if I hadn't provided input, then I don't think the parole board would have had the whole picture either. So I feel just really grateful that I had that opportunity.
Wow, great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Karen, how about you? How did you prepare for the process?
Well, I think Beth covered a lot. You sound, it's very similar, and we're definitely in this together as crime victims. We can all draw from each other's experiences, and you sound very much like myself. But the way that I try to prepare for comment is I sometimes try to think of it as a journal, if you will, like, how they sometimes say that if you write your emotions down, it helps to release the pain and the trauma from within you, and it can be very therapeutic. Just as if you speak with a therapist or something like that, you're releasing what's weighing you down. But who better to release that pain to than a board member? They should know exactly how this crime has impacted you as the victim. Just release it, get it out there, let it sit with them. And, so that way they can make the proper decision. And if possible, to just get into that headspace of thinking of your statement as a release and putting it out there and just kind of releasing it. I think that could be very helpful. And personally, that's what I try to do when preparing for comment.
Right. Now tell me this, Karen, have you provided comment more than once?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, wait, now, did you know, like, were you told by the Office of Victim Advocate that the first time you provided testimony that it's going to be recorded and it would be available to play for the board a second time if the person comes back for the board? Yes.
Yes.
And then you decided to provide comment a second time, even though you knew that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So tell us why and like how you worked through that decision.
Well, things can change from year to year. So, what I may have stated to the board the first time or the second time, something could have changed. An inmate could violate stay away orders by contacting their family members and having them contact you and what have you. So I think it's very, very important to inform the board of any, of any kind of changes that are made in your case. And also exercising my right is very, very important to me. Coming back and, expressing my feelings about the whole thing, telling the board my story. And I also believe that tone can be very, very important. I mean, you can read something in black and white or, review a video or something like that, but it's never going to resonate the way I think sitting before an actual member would. Hearing your tone, hearing your words, seeing the emotion in your face. I think that's far greater impact, in trying to convey your story to a board member.
I think, yeah, I can appreciate that. I think that Beth kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'll let you both touch on it. Tell me, how do you feel like the process impacts your journey, like do you feel like it's helpful in any way towards your own like personal healing process or anything like that?
Should I go?
Oh, go ahead, Karen, you go, and then we'll go to Beth.
Okay, I wasn't sure. Well, it gives me a feeling, more that I'm included when it comes to the crime that was committed against me. These crimes have forever changed our lives, and having the right to be able to speak my piece is extremely important to me. In the very, very beginning, victims were only allowed to give written testimony, a written statement. And in my case, I just didn't feel as though written word could convey what I needed to say. And then finally, I was informed by the Office of Victim Advocate that Pennsylvania was now allowing victims to give in-person testimony. And I was extremely grateful for that opportunity. I was extremely nervous and I did not know what to expect, but my advocate walked me through it the best that she could, and she encouraged me to use my right, just to exercise my right, use my voice. And although it is one of the hardest things that I've ever been put through, I'm not going to lie, it was extremely hard. I wanted to make my voice heard to the people who were the decision makers in my case. And I felt that it made all of the difference in the world by allowing me to remain present and to have my voice heard regarding the crime that ultimately changed my life forever.
Thank you. Beth, how about you? How do you feel the process impacted your journey?
Well, again, well said, Karen. A lot of similarities. And like Karen said, the process is kind of a roller coaster. It's I'm not going to lie, it was difficult. Bringing all that up to the surface. And mine, I provided testimony 3 times in person and then written over a 7-year period. So it was like bringing it up again and again. So that was a lot of trauma. However, and I'm sure this is different for everyone, but for me, as stressful as it was each time, it was an incredible healing experience. In April of 2016, my husband and I drove to Harrisburg, and we were able to be there in person and talk to, there was one parole board member there in person in the room and one online. And I was able for the first time to talk about the impact that these crimes had on me. And it's funny because I wasn't able to give an impact statement during the trial, like during sentencing. I don't know if they even did that back then, 28 years earlier. And in my mind, I always thought that I had given one. I'm like, yeah, I gave an impact statement. Of course I did. And then I started thinking about it. And eventually I realized, no, what I did was told them what this man had done to me, which is so different than the impact that his crimes had on me. So this was the first time, that I was able to really do that. And I went in there and I spoke honestly, and I sometimes had to look at my notes because I was like Karen said, very nervous and shaking. I sobbed through the entire 45-minute testimony. Even my husband was able to have the opportunity to talk about how this man whom he never met had affected his life. It affected our relationship and our marriage. And after debriefing with Annette from OVA, we went out into the car and sat in the car and sobbed, but we felt such relief. And I know, again, this will be different for everyone, but it was, it's hard to describe, but it was I felt freedom and peace, regardless of what the decision was. I did find out 3 years later that he was going to be released, and I did not regret that I had done what I did.
Awesome. That's great. I like how you pointed out the difference between what the person did to you and the impact that it had on you. That's that's really powerful. And that is something that when we as an office are preparing survivors to give their comment, that we try to let them know that the parole board does have like the details of the crime. But what we want you to do is talk about how this has impacted you, because that could be so different, years down the line, what that impact will look like. So yeah, that's great that you brought that out. That can be quite different in information and what you bring to the table. So thank you. Board Member Fox, let's just jump back to you. Tell us about what are some of the limitations as well as the powers of the parole board?
Well, we have, I guess, the power to parole and to re-parole. So if somebody comes back as a violator, we can parole them again a second time. We obviously set conditions of parole. And that's really where we work very closely with our victim advocates office. Those conditions can set geographic restrictions on an individual to keep them out of a neighborhood, keep them out of a city, keep them out of a county. We can generally give no contact type conditions that are important to keep individuals away from people, their victims' families. We can impose treatment, curfew. We have a number of things that we can do that will kind of limit the individual when they are out. They have to answer those conditions. And if they all don't answer to them, then they can be brought back on violations. So, we have two different types of violators. We call them convicted parole violators. Those are go out and they commit a crime. Or we have technical parole violators, which kind of makes it sound so minimal. But a technical parole violator violates a condition that has been imposed. But sometimes they're not so technical. Like, in other words, they're taken very seriously. And agents move on them very quickly. So if we do release someone and now they're contacting a victim when they've been pretty cleanly instructed not to, those are things that the parole agents take very, very seriously, and the board takes very, very seriously. Now, you talked about the limitations. In 2012, the legislation did pass some legislation that limits our authority with technical parole violators. So, prior to 2012, if you had a domestic violence individual that got out and contacted a victim, and it was his first violation, you could still set a review for them and kind of see where they're at before you would put them back out on the street. But if they don't violate any law now, essentially what it says is there's 6 months is the maximum that we can hold them on a first violation, 9 months on a second, and 12 months on third or subsequent ones. So we generally take a lot of effort to sort of protect our victims and make sure that's it, but it is one of the limitations that's under the law. And it somewhat reflects now the way, because I've worked prior to the law and after the law. And sometimes it reflects the way I vote, because I understand that, if this person gets out, that it's not as easy to sort of put them back in for a long, long time as it used to be. So I guess those are the powers that we have. And it really is an awesome power. And if I could just comment a little bit, because you talked a little bit, I think it's important about, the decision to come back before the board and talk to us again. And I think each victim makes that in their own mind. I see some victims, and it's almost like they feel like somehow that this decision, the weight of the decision is based on them. And they come back and they're kind of angry at the ability, because they feel like they have to come back and talk with us. And they sort of assume that decision, almost like somehow the weight of this decision depends entirely on them. And as I talked to earlier, there's a number of factors that go into these decisions. They're tough decisions. We never make everyone happy anytime we make a decision. But I just want to urge people, as you're kind of considering this, if you're considering doing this, and you want to come back, it's wonderful to have that right and to explain to us what has changed. And we've had victims that have said, no, I don't want this person paroled at one point, and come back years later and said, you know what, it's fine if you parole them now. So things do change, but also not to understand that it is the board's decision. We don't want you to feel like you're taking ownership by making the decision to appear before us, if that's something that makes sense.
It makes sense, and I hear what you're saying, and I think that's kind of like makes the challenge, even as advocates, it makes it so hard because we can see like the pain that it sometimes causes. Like even like I've heard many people say just getting the letter from us, like the pain and the trauma that sends to them, and we want to try to find a way to avoid that and make that not happen. But sometimes that's just part of the reality and part of empowering the survivors, that if they say they want that letter, though, even though we know that that letter is probably going to hurt them and make them have a bad day, that we still send that letter. And I'm all for, like, I mean, I really don't like confrontation. So when I try to make sure that people understand, hey, listen, the video's there and they will watch it again. You do not have to do this again. And sometimes, you know, they're crying and they're with the support dog and they're like, oh no, I'll be back. That
Sure.
they don't
Yeah.
care how hard it is, that they want to be there. They want to continue to be a part of the process. So that is like a struggle to understand that we have to provide that empowerment so that the person can make the decision on their own, and that we can't like protect them and make it better. Like I wish there was a way that I could protect them and make it better, but so far I haven't found one. Like even like it makes me feel so bad when people say how bothered they are just because they get the letter, but there's no way around it.
Our
And
system,
we haven't thought of it yet.
our system is an indeterminate sentencing system. So the board kind of makes that decision initially when someone reaches their minimum. And then they have the right to be seen every year in many cases. Now we have some exceptional cases where they're not seen. They can be they don't have the right to be seen every year. But because of that, we understand that the law is just inherently difficult for individuals. And I think because hopefully the board, I mean, we try to be very receptive to individuals and try to make this as painless as possible. And I know the Victim Advocate Office does a really, really good job working with people to try to make this at least as painless and as it can be. And so we really appreciate that.
So Heather, that's going to bring me to you. Heather is the advocate in our office who kind of oversees this program, and you've been doing this for quite some time. Tell us about how you prepare the staff at OVA for the comment process.
In the beginning, this process began in September 2013. So it was a new process for everyone. I initially, along with Mr. Fox, we went to New York and actually saw how other states modeled the system and then brought all that information back to PA to see what was going to work best for our offices.
Oh, awesome.
So the process has definitely changed a lot over the years. We first started with our staff. We were only doing the testimonies in our Harrisburg office, physically in person. There wasn't the option to Zoom in. At that time, it took a few years before we were able to video conference in victims if they wanted to go to another victim services provider within the county they resided in. And as we've grown, we now hold them every other month in some of our regional locations, where we do Pittsburgh 1 month, and we also have Philadelphia another month. So the victims on those sides of the states don't have to travel as far if they physically want to be present in person and sit across the table from the board members, because it's a very stressful process. We understand that. We don't want to put more trauma on traveling when you're upset and emotional. So I'm hoping we expand our locations as well, so we can give more to the victims. Our staff is prepared. When new staff comes on, we show them previous testimony videos of clients who have come in and provided testimony over the years, so they know what to expect. We sit down, we go over, they are assigned a case every single month. Most of our advocates in Harrisburg, we can do up to 60 cases a month of in person, or they also have the option to Zoom in now with the technology. And then our regional sites hold up to 12 cases a day. So potentially we're doing 72 cases of victim comments per month in the 2 different locations. So our fabulous staff at OVA is highly trained in multiple skills. We have great advocates who are specialized in sexual assault, domestic violence. So I try to assign the cases to those advocates where I know their strong suits, depending on the crime. Everybody's highly qualified. They will take the time once they get their cases assigned to them at the beginning of every month. They get their cases for the following month. So on average, it's about 4 cases per advocate. If they're in the Harrisburg office, they will research those cases, and then they're going to reach out to the victims and their families. They're going to go over the process with the families. They're going to ask if they have any questions. They are going to find out who's coming with them. That time they're going to get some information about the crime, but also about the impact, because they really want to let the board know about the impact. So our advocates do stress, how has this impacted you? How's it impacted your family? What conditions are you looking for? If he's paroled, he or she is paroled this time or maybe next year, we need to think about conditions of parole. Now that's a hard conversation for a lot of families because they don't want to think about that, but our staff goes through these are the options we could ask for. And you might not always get all those conditions either. Some people want 3 or 4 counties. We have to narrow that down to what county do you reside in? Where do you work at? Where do you live? Our advocates will always advocate to the board, whatever the client's request. So they're going to do the best to get what the clients have requested. I think I went off sidetracked.
No, that's good.
Sorry.
No. So you've been doing this for how long?
Since this process started in September 2013. We started researching in 2012, yeah.
All right, so tell us about some feedback that you've heard from victims, whether positive or negative, about the
Sure. The number one positive thing we hear is they're very supportive. They're supportive of our office. They're thankful. They're grateful of the opportunity to get their voices heard. The power we give them to sit across the table instead of it, like Karen said, being a piece of paper. You're putting more human perspective on their situation. It's not just Karen's letter signed Karen, this was her story. There's no face. It just makes it more real. The feelings that come out. It's hard for a lot of our clients to come in and do this, but they definitely feel like they're getting their power back. Their voices are heard. They're speaking for their deceased loved one, getting their memory alive and doing everything they think they can do to do what's best for their family or themselves if they were the direct victim of the crime. So they're always very appreciative of the process. We thankful to be heard. That's the big one. Just thankful that their voices are finally heard. Because a lot of them, like Beth said, they didn't have the option at sentencing to be heard. So this is the first time through the whole process that they're getting their voices heard.
Wow, that's cool.
We don't hear a lot of negatives. We hear people just would like us to keep the inmates incarcerated the entire sentence. So they're not sometimes happy with the decisions, but as Mr. Fox said, we don't have control over that. So it's very positive and powerful.
Great. What can a first-time survivor expect in the way of support from OVA staff members if they're deciding, okay, I'm going to participate in the process?
Sure. They're going to get a phone call from one of our advocates, and they're going to go over the entire process. They're going to go over the different factors of parole with the survivor, so they know what the board is looking for, all the facts that Mr. Fox stated earlier. Mm-hmm. They're going to receive support if they need help with their statement. We highly recommend just jotting notes down or writing your statement out, because sometimes with trauma, when you're in the middle of discussing things, your mind might go blank. And if you have those notes in front of you, it's a helpful resource to make sure that your voice is being heard and you're not forgetting anything that you wanted to come across as saying. They are going to get support constantly on the phone. And we also do Zoom now, which is great with the technology. So if they want that face-to-face appearance with their advocate to go through information, we will schedule prep sessions through Zoom. A lot of them do the phone calls, but we have more and more clients that are requesting Zoom preps with their advocates. And then they will have the support during the day of when they come in for their victim comment. The advocate will be with them through the entire process. When they come into our office in Harrisburg, we are grateful to have a therapy dog on site. which is also very therapeutic for staff and clients as well, and board members. So they are going to be with the client in the beginning. When they come in, they're going to be prepped with the advocate. That's going to be just a little bit of time with the advocate, just with the advocate and the clients, to go over any last minute questions, feedback. And then they will go into the session with the board. The advocate will be with the family at all times, or the clients. And we do video and audio record the testimony. If they do not want to come back, we share that evidence every single time with the board members. But we always let that up to the families. We know every family is different. But we only have it's about 26.6% roughly clients who return. So a lot of people first time, it's very small about the clients that actually come back for, like Karen has, and both Karen and Beth came back multiple times. It's a little rare. So a lot of people are satisfied with the video testimony. We get some that will send in an updated letter after the fact saying, please watch the video. I haven't changed my decision, or I've changed these feelings. Please pass this along to the board. So it's very low. And then after the testimony is over, the advocates will debrief with the family, make sure they're okay, answer any questions they might have about the process. And then that advocate is going to follow this case. So it takes, depending on the inmate is docketed, it can be 4 to 8 weeks before they have a decision. And then we always know the waiting game is very hard for people. So some families will call them, the advocates, every day, say, hey, what's the status of the case today? Can you check for me? It takes 2 seconds. To give somebody peace of mind, please call. Please give us a call. We will check the status at all times. We're going to let you know the outcome. As soon as we know a decision, if it's either for parole or refusal parole, that advocate is going to reach out to their families and say, this is the decision, talk them through that, what it means. If there were conditions of parole that were requested that the families wanted that weren't in the board action, they'll go back to the board and see what they can do to maybe include those decisions. They are going to focus on self-care with the families as well. Really, the big part of that debriefing is letting the victims know, please go take care of yourself. Whatever that looks like for you. Is it gardening? Is it getting a nice dinner? Going for a run, a walk, reading a book? Just really self-care. We know this is a very traumatic situation. It's bringing up a lot of memories for people, but it's also very powerful. And we want them to go take care of themselves at the end of that day.
All right. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Karen and Beth, tell me about what you do, what suggestions you might have for other survivors when we talk about self-care and managing trauma as a result of the process. Go ahead, Karen. I see you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Well, I try to remember that I'm human. I'm only human, and it's okay to have good days as well as bad days. It's okay to take a break when I need one, and everything that we do to just try to be okay is more than enough. Try to remember to go easy on yourself. It's extremely important to know that you are definitely not alone in this. The more that I found out about other survivor stories and coming to the OVA and giving in-person testimony, the more I felt, supported, if you will. There are so many survivors going through what we're going through, and I personally find that moral support is definitely the key to healing.
Awesome. Beth?
Yeah, same with me. And one of the things that I did before I did my in-person testimony was I wrote a list for myself of everything that I was grateful for, everything that I had in my life now that maybe I didn't have later or earlier, and the things that I've done, the things that bring me joy. And I read it after the testimony or comments, whatever you're calling it. And we sat in the car and I read through every one of them. And there were things like, my incredible support system. I have my husband, my family, my friends, a therapist who all knew what was going on, who I could call them at any time. And I did, and I didn't always used to do that. I had a puppy that I could play with. I loved outdoors, so camping was always so grounding. My husband and I ballroom dance. And, when we'd feel sad or, kind of hopeless, we'd just dance for 45 minutes and then we'd feel, just lighter and more connected to each other. Just all those different things. I'm a musician. Sometimes I'd play, sometimes I'd make a playlist of happy songs or even sad songs. Maybe I needed to cry for an hour, who knows? I know probably a lot of people have been called resilient. I know I've been called resilient, which is great. But I also think that resilience is a kind of a misunderstood word. And I feel like it can put pressure on trauma survivors to be like superhuman or stoic or have to do it by yourself. But resilience doesn't mean that like trauma doesn't exist or that it's not painful or stressful or that you don't take time to heal or things, get messy. It just means that we can overcome by using our inner and outer resources, whatever they are. And that's how we adapt to trauma. And I feel like that's what's the most important. We have to figure out what that is for each of us. I've tried, yoga and meditation, and that doesn't work for me. So like, you kind of have to find out what does, and, anybody who's thinking about going through this, the main thing is I hope you can find a support system and use that support system before you even consider this, because it's just so important, like Karen said.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I think it is so important to, like you said, kind of like celebrate the wins, whatever they are. Sometimes you got to start with small, like, hey, girlfriend, did you get up today? There you go. You're still breathing? Come on now. Some of the stuff that people have been through. Yeah, so that's awesome. We're winding down towards the end, and before we sign off today, I do want to share some comments from someone who is currently going through the process but did not feel safe being on the program. But before I do that, I want to ask Board Member Fox one more question, and that's, what do you like most about the work that you do?
Thanks. First off, I think it's vitally important work. And what I like about it is that my experience, I think in 9 years of supervision on the street and now 13 years of making parole decisions, I think puts me in a position where I feel like I can protect the community in a good way and still make sound decisions to let individuals out of prison, for societal reasons overall. So I do feel that way. But I know it's hard work and it's difficult work, and the decisions are never easy. So it's challenging every day. But there's certain parts of it that I'm really quite honored to do. And honestly, it's a privilege to listen to the testimonials from these victims. And I feel that every time that I do it, because it's just to hear from them and to communicate and to understand where they came from and where they are now, and to see that is very, very important. I don't think anybody prepares you for the type of work you do as a board member. I remember my first probably couple of weeks on the job, I thought I was really prepared. And I remember reading through the files, went back, and we can remember when we had big paper files and thick files, and it was victim input. And it was a letter. It wasn't a face-to-face. It was just a letter from a young girl who had been abused. And I remember just sitting there, just tears streaming down my face as I read this letter. And I was like, wow, this is really emotional work to do. So if we seem stoic sometimes because we feel like we have to be when we deal with the victims directly, it's not that type of work. But because of that, I think that's what life's all about. It's all about learning and giving and all those things. And I think the board gives you a chance to do that, believe it or not. So that's why I like it.
Well, thank you so much. And we certainly appreciate the work that you do and the collaborative relationship that the Office of Victim Advocate has with the Parole Board is so important. I think when I started, I never had really thought about the fact of the importance of parole and community safety, because the person is being released, but still having that umbrella of supervision. And that is a very important piece. But like I mentioned, I do want to share some of these comments from a survivor who, like I said, is still currently going through the process and does not feel comfortable being on screen. But we asked them how they feel about the victim comment process and how it impacts their journey. And this is their response. We feel anxious long before the date approaches. In fact, we feel it whenever a letter arrives in the mail from the OVA. But we also feel our input to the board about the emotional impact we feel about losing our daughter and the despicable way it happened, stabbed or slashed 55 times, could sway parole board members to keep this man in his full 30 years. That's 30 years other potential victims might be spared from an early death. These parole board reviews are definitely challenging to us. To give the correct kinds of testimony, we need to relive precisely what happened to our beloved child. We give it in graphic detail. We tirelessly researched. We need the board to know and feel the unbridled force this man put upon this young woman when he mercilessly stabbed her. We want the board to know that we carry our loss with us every single day. Every photo of her in our house calls out to us. The thousands of precious memories we still hold now come with an asterisk that says, she's not here anymore. Someone murdered her and she's not coming back. We suffer major stress and anxiety thinking about her final moments, and the board reviews force us to bring it all back like it's happening all over again. But we do it for our daughter. We do it for justice. We do it to keep this man from ruining his next target. We are certain he will do that. Our daughter was not the first person he harmed. We know this. And then here's how they manage the trauma. Instead of allowing the victim comment process to emotionally defeat us, so as best as we can, we keep our minds on preparing for our presentation to the board by putting our emotional energies to good use. We have a mission and we cannot lose our limited chances to fight for our lost daughter and for the hundreds of women who are abused physically and emotionally. We try to put our feelings aside. Thus far, we have been successful in doing our part. We will be ready for the next time. So with that, I want to say thank you to all of our guests tonight, particularly to the victims and the survivors who do participate and add to this process. It's such a valuable source of information for the board, and we appreciate all that it takes to be a part of the process. Hey, and if you have suggestions or things that you think OVA could do to help to make the process better, please don't hesitate to email us or call us. We are always looking for any ways. Like we said, if we could, we'd find a way that we could protect everyone and make it super easy, but we just have not found a way to do that. And we know that it is empowering and that we should not be looking to take that away from survivors in any way. But if you have suggestions about how we can make the process a little better, please don't hesitate to let us know. And thanks again for joining us. And we look forward to you meeting up again with us next month for our Monday night meetup. Thank you so much.